if I was to think about a young player who I coached back in the day, really good dribbler, but really lightweight, got a professional contract, went into the first team, all of a sudden a skill that he could do right the way through as a 9-year-old to 16 comfortably, and no one could ever really get near him. By the time he was narrowing around the first team players, they were knocking him off the ball. They were smart, they were wily, and he had to make some real adjustments to his game. So I questioned myself and sort of said, you know, how could we have helped him earlier in the journey rather than hitting a brick wall.
Hello and welcome to Coaching Cards. I'm Lee and I'm joined by Claire and Warren to talk about growth and maturation. Let's kick things off with the first card. What does growth and maturation mean to you, and why is it important for coaches to learn about it?
I suppose from playing myself, from a young kid, so I was always one of the bigger kids, so physically stronger, quicker, so I was fortunate with that, and it wasn't really until I went into coaching that I realised how important it was in respect of giving players time to develop. They grow at all different rates and stages, which can be a disadvantage to some and an advantage for others. And I think you just need to make sure that there's a balance somewhere along the line, because the player with the most physical, who's the quickest and the strongest, needs a challenge, they might have to play up, and the player who's maybe not as developed may need to play down.
So it could be like a bit like a generic understanding of like how the body grows and how people grow and develop physically.
And I think physiologically is the thing that we see, but there's other things that happen as well, isn't it? So psychologically, so mentally and everything else. But in terms of that growth bit, I think we're discussing around that physiological versus biological age, isn't it? So where we're looking at, and probably reverse to what Warren was just saying there, about those late developers. So the early developers, late developers, and how we can help support the individual that's in front of us.
I guess the importance is just that like generic understanding that everybody grows at different rates, everybody goes through maturation at different moments, and accepting it and understanding that, and then a consideration for, well, what does my training, what does my coaching, what does match day look like to support those individuals?
I think the relevance to the female game is just mentioned that girls and boys will naturally, in theory, if you stereotypically, will develop the same in that foundation phase. The differences come into the youth phase. So that's the big one where a lot happens, where we have to try to keep an eye, identify, trigger support and help them in pinch points in terms of those long-term athlete development designs and programs. So when we're actually playing football, mixed football is fine till about under 9s. And typically the girls will develop physiologically earlier than the boys. So you may find the big tall girl at 10 and 11, but that might not happen till the boys till they're 12, 13, 14.
I think also, again, experiencing that, probably like you said, sort of around about the YDP phase, sort of 12 to 16, you could sign a player in an academy at 9 years of age, talented, moves well, agile, hit 12, body just goes all over the place, coordination goes, can't kick the ball, can't stand up, like Bambi on ice. Being a coach and having to experience that and observe it, it was trying to gain an understanding as to what actually was going on.
Just generally for coaching, but like especially grassroots football, is just accepting that there's going to be different heights and different sizes, different speeds and different strengths as they grow up, and that will fluctuate a little bit. So that's generally, I think, but then that understanding of like, don't pigeonhole them into like a certain position or a certain area of the pitch, maybe because of size at a young age, because there's a possibility that they might not be the tallest person at some stage, they might not be the quickest person at some stage, and that will even itself out. To help coaches answer the following questions to provide examples of how growth and maturation could affect the player at different age phases.
Well, I'd certainly say for the younger one, football is supposed to be more fun. From 5 to 11, fun, participate. So if you're undernaturated and you're not getting much of the ball, and players won't pass it to you because you're not physically strong enough to be able to stay on the ball, you're probably not going to be part of that game much, so therefore your confidence is going to go. So it'd be very important that be mindful of those type of players.
I remember when I was like younger, playing against one of my mates, and he was like massive, like you looked in the air to him like, what's he doing up there, type of thing. But it ended up evening itself out. But when we played against him, like he would just run through everybody, play midfield, he can get up and down the pitch because of the size of his legs, the stride that he had. Can bully people a little bit because of his size, but eventually like that caught up.
Levels out.
Yeah, and he always played in centre midfield. So you start to put him in different positions. Like he wasn't 100% sure with those positions. So I think certainly for the youngest age group of kids, we spoke about it before, but accepting that they're going to grow at different rates, but also not to pigeonhole them because somebody is tall or fast or whatever it might be, putting him into a certain position. Because using that example, like he struggled playing different positions when he was a similar height to other people because he'd been pigeonholed from an early age. So I think that would be really important, especially for the younger players. What about in terms of your experience of the female game? How would, in terms of the importance of different phases of that, what are your thoughts and opinions on that one?
I think definitely mentioned about fun. I think it's the why. Why are they there? My experience is to deal with academy, so it is about a talent and a talent ID pool. So, you know, invariably age characteristics, it's about me, my, I. So if you're looking at them, if they're really good passers of the ball, well, 6, 7, 8-year-olds aren't going to do that. So there's similar characteristics that are non-gender specific, I would say. That's why they can play amongst each other. You know, there isn't necessarily the difference amount there. It is then about the next as they're moving into the youth development phase, you know, about when and how they change that. The physical literacy needs to be there. So, you know, not being too much of a specialisation in football. Ideally, it's let them play lots of different sports. And if we can help encourage that, just to kind of improve the ABC, such as agility, balance and coordination, to help them and their bodies understand themselves. But then as they move through, it's then about the importance of actually reassuring them that it happens to everyone. So I think then we've got to be mindful of when they're getting to their bodies are growing and they're changing, that it happens. It's a fundamental part of life. There's going to be change. There's going to be changes to their body and how they look and how they perceive themselves. You know, image is going to be important. The peers come involved in that. But then also the other bit we mentioned about is like parents have got to be educated about it as well, because there will be a lack of performance. You know, they suddenly can't strike that ball like they could do. You know, even just 6 months ago to 3 months. You know, why can't they suddenly? Why is this change happening? But the key thing is to reassure them, make an open environment to have those conversations, and then as we're planning sessions, right, we need to be mindful X, Y and Z might be going through this type of spurt, you know, because there'll be several of them, it's not just one or two.
What about for like your experience of like young players going from youth development football into first team environments? I'm interested in like, what challenges have you seen there in terms of young players that might be like 16 to 18, 16 to 21, and then making that step into like the adult open age game?
If I was to think about a young player who I coached back in the day, really good dribbler, but really lightweight, got a professional contract, went into the first team, all of a sudden a skill that he could do right the way through as a 9-year-old to 16 comfortably, and no one could ever really get near him. By the time he was narrowing around the first team players, they were knocking him off the ball. They were smart, they were wily. And he had to make some real adjustments to his game. So I questioned myself and sort of said, you know, how could we have helped him earlier in the journey rather than hitting a brick wall when he became a professional. So again, now if the same situation was going to happen again, you know, exposing him to that a little bit earlier. It might sound silly, but exposing him to that a bit earlier, because then he has to gather other skills to make him survive in that environment, rather than having to take another year and a half to then adjust, to then go again.
For all coaches then, maybe supporting players to play against other people that have got different characteristics than them, and just thinking about maybe that your match day team selections. So if you've got your dribbler as an example, like playing them up against somebody who's physically stronger than them to provide that challenge throughout their development journey. So it's not just it comes to them at a moment in time and they're in the same position and all of a sudden they can't deal with it, or it may be playing against somebody who's quicker than them to help them to be able to deal with that challenge.
Next question. Lee, do you have any top tips to help coaches tailor training sessions to accommodate players at different stages of growth and development?
One of the general things that would be important for me is to give players a variety of spaces to take part in the game and practices, but and also vary the numbers that they play against and the numbers within different spaces so we give them different types of movement skills. So whether that's like long distance sprints, whether it's short, sharp movements, it could be refining something because they're going through a growth spurt in a smaller area. So yeah, that would be different spaces, different numbers of players to give them different experiences would be my top tip, if you like, for coaches.
Okay, what can coaches do on match day to help players with growth and maturation?
I think clear communication to know what you're doing. So I think just turning up on a match day, suddenly mentioning what your match day or who's going to start doesn't help players prepare. So I think, as a coach, be really open and transparent about why you're selecting a team. who plays how to do. If it's foundation phase, equal game time, rotate around who and when and what they're playing. Youth phase into pro, you have to get them to understand and experience they may not play at different points.
Yeah, I guess my take on it would be like volume, variety and exposure. So what I mean by that is like game time. So if it's all equal and everybody gets 30 minutes every week, then you're only used to playing 30 minutes. Whereas it might be 1 week you play for 40 minutes, but the week after you play for 20 minutes. So I think in terms of like the amount of game time that you play, give players exposure to longer periods and shorter periods. And then I think in terms of like that's the volume variety would be to provide them, especially as they're growing up, with a variety of positions to play in. And we've spoken about that a little bit already, but just give them an opportunity to play on the left side of the pitch, the right side of the pitch in more of a defensive position, somewhere down the middle of the pitch where the game's in front of you. It might be from a centre midfield position where the game's 360 around you. So to give them that variety, as well as the volume in terms of game, the volume of time as well as the variety, and then the exposure to playing against different people with different attributes. So I might have played as a centre midfield player 1 week, and we might have been up against somebody personally in terms of an individual duel that I could dominate from a physical perspective. But what about when we come up against somebody who is physically similar to me? So I would go exposure to different players with different attributes would be massively important, especially like 12 to 16s growing up, even a younger age group of players, but that's more about the variety, maybe not as purposeful, but I think I'd certainly be a bit more purposeful about those things as we start to go into like the teenage years. Will be my take on that one, match days.
I think the other thing that probably you probably need to consider is the slighter players who, if it's I don't know, if it's 20 minutes, they might not be able to do, they might only be able to do 20 minutes of a game. Because their legs just can't get them around the pitch and physically they can't deal with that. So it's knowing who can do what. So if there's players who need stretching a bit more, you can stretch them. And ultimately, at the end of it, it becomes, you're playing and you've got to accept that you're not playing. But then it's how are you then going to give them match minutes somewhere else? Are they going to drop down? Are they going to play up, etc.? So it's being mindful that it's not just in the team that they're in. They might have to go up or down to experience other minutes to have an impact in a game situation that might suit them better.
I think match days are important because it's important to them. Match days are really important to them, so we have to be mindful actually if we're affecting that, they're going to take that personally and to heart. I think as we go through the development of the players, the formations help that development, but we've got to be aware as coaches if they're moving from 4v4, 5v5, 7v7, 9v9, 11v11. We don't all chronologically develop that way in terms of like our age and stage, in terms of physiologically. We don't just suddenly go, we can play that. So we might be mindful that like we've just moved from 7v7 to 9v9, but you can cope because you've developed a capacity to do that. Your aerobic capacity can do it. I haven't grown that yet. So as a coach, we've got to be mindful actually, can only play that 20 minutes for this moment in time, but you can play 40 minutes of it.
That player might only be able to play 20 minutes in the game. As you know, as the game gets on, it gets stretched, people get tired. It might be just to put them in the last 20 when people are tired and the game is a bit more open. Instead of them being marked tightly, every time he gets the ball or she gets the ball, they're marked tightly. All of a sudden, the game's stretched now. They've got more time to operate with space. That could be a massive, massive psychological boost to that individual. So it's knowing when to pitch them in at the right time in the game as well. If it isn't at the start and it is at the end, it might be really impactful for them.
Do you have any advice to help coaches identify if players are finding it tough to adapt to how they're growing and developing? And is there a way to discover how far or how far away through a growth spurt players are?
I would probably just start that off with knowing your players. That's the first thing. So knowing your players, look at traits, look at behaviours as they're going through this stage, might then give you an insight into their growing. Obviously the coordination is a big key identifier. And then just like trying to speak to them to get as much, to make them as open as possible. How you feeling? If they've got aches and pains, how are you getting on in training? Just to constantly ask them how they are.
I think in the teenage years, help them to write journals and diaries so they can record things down. And then you can identify the signs and symptoms. We mentioned about fatigue. There's about, aches and pains, moodiness. Obviously females then go through any menstruations that's happening, are they starting cycles? There's all these other bits that kind of we need to add on. So journaling is a really good way of recording, getting them to know their own bodies. Other things will just be like, what's their quality of sleep been like? What have they done that day? Because sometimes you might go, well, you're tired, but you're not really performing today, but not realise they've went and done a schools tournament that day as well. So sometimes physiologically we're not the one thing that the kids are doing. It's not the one thing in their life. They've got other things that are going on, and if they're generally good players, they're in other programmes as well. So they're probably doing other sports, they're playing for their school teams, they're doing their districts. But are we aware of that? Like, are we aware of actually what concentration and volumes, as we mentioned before, what they're doing? Because actually, we might then need to say it and step back and go, we might have to stop you from doing a training session to help you with your loading when you start to go through it. And it's putting it as not a negative, but it's putting it there to support and help them actually play for longer.
Like when your players have had like 3 or 4 weeks off, grassroots players, it might not be grassroots players, but they've had like 3 or 4 weeks where you haven't seen them, younger players I'm talking about, could be over the summer, and they come back after the summer and you're like, somebody's put some fertiliser on them, like they've just grown all of a sudden, you kind of just notice it a little bit. And that's maybe a little bit of an indicator, which is a bit subjective, to go, oh, hold on a minute, they may have had a growth spurt, and then you can start to look for things like their coordination, their first touch. So it could be after like a Christmas period, for example, have 3 or 4 weeks off, and you might have noticed somebody's grown, for instance. But I think when you look at the growth spurt, you can then start to look at things like their first touch. So can they adjust their body to receive a ball effectively? Is the ball like bouncing off of them, and it doesn't usually do those things? Are they getting frustrated a little bit more? So there's things that you might be able to observe as a coach that might be a sign of like a growth spurt in a young player, that might then trigger you as a coach to like work and understand them and support them in a little bit of a different way.
How important is it that coaches show patience and positivity when they notice players struggling to adapt with growth spurts?
I think it's massively important. Like I think we just touched on it a second ago, like understanding it first of all, understanding what a growth spurt is, and understanding how to support a person, because it could be a technical challenge that they're going through where they can't control the ball, they can't turn as effectively, can't turn as proficiently as they were because they've shot up a little bit by an inch or so. The knock-on effect could be the social element of that within the team. So all the other players might look at them and go, like, what's going on? Like, why can't you control the ball? You was brilliant before. So it might affect how other people see them. So it could be then a confidence issue, a psychological issue. It could be their standing, like they might be the person that everybody looks up to in the group in terms of their ability to play the game. And there might be 1 or 2 things in terms of their growing that knock them off that perch. So how do we as a coach then start to recognise that and support young players as they're growing through this thing? So yeah, I think it's hugely important that we show patience, because they will come through that growth spurt, and if we provide them with activities where they're going to refine some of their movement skills as they get a little bit older, things will be fine, but having patience to understand it, I think, is really important.
That's a really good point, and I've seen where players they want to make so they're making the right decision, but they can't execute it. So then you become process goal orientated rather than outcome, and you've got to identify that to the players and go like, that was really the right idea, don't worry, it will come. So that, they want to play that 30-40 yard pass, but they just haven't got that yet in them. So it was the right decision, but it's not happening at this moment in time because they're going through the development of it. So I think our language and narrative around our behaviours are really important.
Yeah, and I think like 2 things that I think I would advise coaches to do potentially, like to stay patient, would be to take themselves, if it's a training session, like stand further back, like come out of the way of the session a little bit, because you get to see, rather than being like on top of what's going on, you get to see a little bit more broadly. And the other one about a match day is try and sit down. As crazy as it sounds, sit in the dugout or go and buy like a little camping chair and go and sit down, because sitting down has an impact upon your behaviours. To try not to get caught up in it, to sit down would be a little tactic that people could use as and when needed.
Okay, in your opinion, what should coaches know about the relative age effect? What impact can this have? And how important is it for coaches to look at more than just physical development of their players?
Yeah, so relative age effect links to our school years. So if it's just basically the month that you're born, so we work it as 4 quartiles. So quartile 1 from September, October, November. Then we've got quartile 2, December, January, February. Quartile 3, March, April, May. And then quartile 4 from June, July, August. Because we then looked at age and stage, quartile 1 tended to be predominantly, and I'll look at talent ID at this point, was picked because that early developer, the one that was big, tall, who could affect the game now, was then getting chosen, versus quartile 4 when there was lower numbers to it. However, the challenge being said on that, how do we help challenge quartile ones? If they're the early starters, they're the ones who are older than the other ones in the year group. How do we make sure that they're always challenged as well? Because they will be the best player, they will affect the now, but in 2, 3, 4 years' time, they won't be. So I think nowadays we are looking at actually the ones who make it are born in the June months because they are constantly challenged. So they're always looked upon in terms of like, well, I'll keep going because they're always challenged and they keep going at it. So they're actually, the tenacity, the resilience that is built within them is kind of forward them through. So when eventually they are physiologically matched up, shall we say, they kind of make it through and they've got all that other inbuilt around them because they've always been challenged.
Just as an example, like one of my best mates' sons, he's a September birthday. My nephew is an August birthday. But they're the same school year. So there's almost, apart from 6 weeks, like there's kind of almost a year between them, but they play at the same age group. Now, on top of that, my nephew was playing upper year because there was no grassroots team for him to play in of the right age group. So not only is he an August birthday, he's playing upper year, so somebody could be almost 2 years older than him that he's playing against. And that's not his fault and when he was born, but as a coach, to understand like how many people have got September birthdays. And is there an impact upon those that have got September, October, November birthdays compared to those that are their birthdays are kind of July and August? And then also linking back to conversations we had around like positions and minutes on the pitch, because somebody is smaller, potentially because it won't always work like that because they're an August birthday compared to a September birthday. It's like, how do we provide them with some support on the pitch? Just because they're smaller doesn't mean they don't play as much. They get knocked off the ball a little bit. Oh yeah, they can't cope. Well, actually no, they need some support to be able to cope as opposed to they can't and not play. Let's say you've got a full-size pitch and it's split into 4 for training and like the under 10s are on one quarter and the under 11s are on the other quarter. Like play against each other, join in together, so you're playing against different age groups there. If another quarter is the under 9s, well actually the under 10s can play against the under 9s. Or with them and mixing in different weeks. So rather than just sticking in silos to your age group of players, I think there's an opportunity maybe to mix and play against different age groups of players, which will support both those that are flying, if you like, in terms of their growth and maturation, and those that maybe need a bit of additional support. So I think that might be something that coaches could consider, regardless of the environment that they're in.
And I think our only one consideration is that their age is the only one thing that stays linear in terms of their development. It doesn't move and shift. We just need to make sure that the bumps in the road and where we move up and down, the other things will happen. So their growth will happen. They'll be where it's a positive, where it's a negative, where it's a challenge set. So we don't expose them for too much. We don't expose them too less and make it too easy. We just need to manage all that within that and where we can make sure that their development is appropriate to them and who they are.
To wrap up this discussion, what are your quick-fire top tips to help coaches support their players with growth and maturation?
Get to know your players.
Communicate with them, make an environment so they can let you know what's happening and what's going on.
I would say show patience and understanding that they're all going to grow and develop at different rates.